Okay, so today we're going to talk about the first bit of front ends. Altogether, I have 3 front end examples that I want to talk through. So might be 2, maybe 3 sessions. But before we get started, next week we actually kick off Capstone reviews, which is, I know, insane. But there will be a day of presentations on Monday, March the 1st. And because of, everything that's happening in Texas and everything that, I don't know, some people just need a little extra time, I'll do a second round of presentations, not the day after, but a week after. So if you feel like you want to go on one of the particular days, let me know. So the 2 dates are March the 1st and March the 8th. I'll be putting this all in Slack as well so that you'll see it, written out. But yeah, I think that most of you should be able to present on Monday, but definitely extra time is allowed for, yeah, if you need it, but do let me know. I'll also be talking about this at one-on-one starting later. Also on the note of capstone reviews, I know that for the past couple of phase projects, a lot of your reviews I've been doing in 30 minutes. As I mentioned before, I would like to do this in more of like a technical interview style. So I would like to have more time per capstone review. So starting next week, this 2 o'clock slot, this 2 o'clock Eastern slot is actually empty. So feel free to take one of these slots if you'd like. If you have a recurring, I think it really depends on the schedule, but feel free to Slack me and I can see you if we extend like, I don't know, either 30 minutes before or after your slot, depending on where other people's recurring times are. So if you have a recurring, feel free to let me know, or if you want to just take one of the 2 p.m. slots, you can do that as well. And then if I see your name pop up on any of the weeks, I can just remove your recurring slot. So yeah, I'll put this all in Slack as well, just in case. Cool. So today we're going to start talking about front ends. And let me share my full screen with you all so we can talk through what it is that we're doing. All right, so here I have just a Chrome window, and I have my my terminal pulled up here. Let me know if this is too small at the moment, but there's nothing too important that we're looking at on the terminal, just a couple commands. So I've sent you all this, I guess this folder on Slack. So it's in a zip file. If you unzip it, you'll see that within this folder called Flask-demo, there are 3 subfolders, each for a different kind of front end. So going from like easiest to most complicated, we're going to start with Dash. We're going to go to Flask app and then Flask with Dash. So just to show you all what the different front ends look like, let's CD into each one and I'll launch each one to show you what that looks like. So for Dash, pretty simple. All you have to do is, I think it's python run.py. No, wait, python app.py, sorry. So python app.py, basically what this is doing is it is running the Python file app. And when you press enter on your git bash or on your terminal, a local URL will come up. So this local URL, you just copy and paste it into your Google, and then this will pop up. This is actually dummy data from one of my projects I was working on. It takes a little while to load. If you see here, there's a bunch of just random IDs that you can choose from. You can search for a bunch of random things. Another thing that should load in a little bit here is just like a t-SNE. This is just a t-SNE graph. This is an example of just a dashboard. So there's actually, technically you could put machine learning model, you could have a machine learning model running here. What should happen, but I actually took this part out because it's an algorithm for a company. But if I were to search something up, this would actually run some sort of NLP model and then spit out some results related to that here. So you can actually have models running in Dash. So this should look kind of similar for those of you who've played with Plotly. These are actually all Plotly graphs. And I'll talk about it in a bit, but basically if you are working on Jupyter Dash, to get from Jupyter Dash to this, very, very straightforward. But we'll come back to this. I do want to show you all the other examples as well. So when you're in this, it's actually very, very important that you remember, if you're running something like this, you actually do Control C, the same thing to stop your Jupyter notebook to exit out of it. One issue if you don't Control C is that if you try and run this again, it'll say that this URL is currently being used by another app. And the only way I've found to get around it is to actually restart your computer. I have not figured out the smart way to fix it. So this is an example of Dash. I next want to show you all the next one, which is just a Flask app. So a Flask app, which is the second folder that I have here. Flask app. This is more for just running if you have a if you just have a machine learning model that you want to deploy onto an app. So to run a Flask app, and I have this command in Slack as well, it's flask_app equals to app.py. And again, it's app.py because I'll also show you the Python file is what spins up the app. And then Flask app equals to app.py followed by Flask run. So with that, something similar comes up. You see there's a different URL here. And if we just run this URL instead, this is one of my Flask apps. I think I've showed you all this before at some point, but this is an NLP classification project that I did. Basically to detect if something is an innuendo or not. So the way it works is we have this home page here. It takes in any text input. So for example, this, press submit, it runs the model. You can actually see here that it's running the model and all my warnings get output here, but you get your result. And based on your classification result, there is a different page. So this is the other option. I will say that these pages look very, very simple because they are. If anyone wants to dabble with more like HTML, you can definitely make this look a lot nicer. But this template is here for you all, and I'll sort of explain how this is set up too. So this is the Flask app, and again, to quit, it's always Control C again. And the last one that I wanted to show you all, this one we'll probably get into only tomorrow. But the last one is, I think it's Flask with Dash. That's right, Flask with Dash. And I always need to just check. The name of this is run.py. So we're going to launch it by doing Python run.py. So similar thing comes up. Now this is a combination of the first two that I showed you all. So this has a Flask app, but also has a page that is a dashboard. For some reason, when you combine the two, the files get way more complicated. So this does take a little bit more time to talk through. So this unlikely I'll talk about tomorrow. But for this one, just to show you what it's like, there is a simple dashboard. I just put dummy data over here. So this is just your dashboard page. Of course, you can set it up it uses Dash as well. So again, and I'll talk about this tomorrow in more detail, but if you have Jupyter Dash code, you just plug it into here and it will run as well. So there's this, but I actually have been meaning to add like a little URL. But if I go to the model page of this is a different classifier. So this is just another one of my projects, another one of my NLP projects to see if your text is more art or programming. That's just what my project was. And then same thing as the last example, it can take in a text input, give you some output here, classify something else. What's the other one? There we go. And then based on the results, if it's multi-class, you can definitely also have it route to different pages. And what I meant to put on the other page with the dashboard is, here you see I have a URL that links to the dashboard. Technically, I always forget to do this, but you can have a link that links to the model page. So yeah, these are the three kinds of front ends that I will talk through. I will also send out resources for this, but after I graduated the program, something called Streamlit came out. And Streamlit is actually what I think most of you have seen other students do for their front ends. They all kind of look kind of similar. It's a very, very plug and play way to create a front end and very, very easy to pick up. I've never taught it to any students. I've never used it myself, but students figure it out on their own. Apparently it's pretty easy. You just have to like lay out your models on a page, and yeah, their tutorials are also pretty good. So I'll send out a few resources for that. But I will say Flask itself, which is again what I do the modeling on, is a pretty common front-end framework for just creating simple web applications. So it's always good to have that on your resume as well, but I understand if it's not your priority right now. All right, so again, same thing. Don't forget to Control C out of your out of this, and let's start talking about Dash. But before we get started, any questions so far? All right, so let's cd into Dash and let's talk about some of the files that are in here. All right, so if you look into the Dash folder, it's actually very, very simple. These two are actually just data files that produce some of the visualizations on the page. Actually, let me launch the page real quick. Python f.py. And this is the URL. Where's my Chrome window? There we go. All right, so we'll talk about this Dash app. It takes a little bit of a while. It takes a bit to load just because I think those data files are not very small. But these are basically the Teasney files that create this over here. And everything is on this app.py page. When I open up this app.py page, and let me have Adam launch this real quick. If I open this app.py page, this is actually the exact same code that you would do for Jupyter Dash. So if I just take a look at a Jupyter Dash example, let's see, Plotly Jupyter Dash example, which is, I think here. There we go. In the Jupyter Dash example, and we talked through this the last time, I'll talk through some of the things briefly again. But if you have a Jupyter Dash already set up, and I do recommend starting with Jupyter Dash because it's a lot easier to debug in Jupyter Dash versus, you know, when you have like your .py file here, is you can't just like run single cells to see if like a little change works. So I do recommend starting with Jupyter Dash and then putting your code here. So yeah, if you're already working with Jupyter Dash, great news. You can just port all your code into a Py file. You would have to make sure you have, you know, the specific functions and data files imported, but yeah. Before I get into the specifics of, you know, any of the front ends, I do want to talk about thinking about what you have to save. So far, most of the time we've been working within notebooks, and notebooks are great because it lets us run like, you know, cell by cell. If you want to make a change to a function, you don't have to rerun the entire notebook. You just have to rerun that one cell. Most of the time in production, Jupyter notebooks are not what we use. Jupyter notebooks are more used for, you know, training and fitting models. Jupyter notebooks are used for, you know, testing out if your code works. For example, like, as I said, if you're debugging in a Jupyter notebook, so much easier than debugging something in Python, because the way that a Python file works is that the whole thing is being compiled at once. Whereas for Jupyter Notebook, you can run cell by cell. You can run them out of order if needed. You can run just specific parts of it. But if you have a singular Py file, when you run a Py file, it actually executes everything in your everything in the entire Py file. So therefore, it makes debugging a little bit harder, especially if, you know, if you have functions that take a long time to run, you would have to do that over and over again. So that's why very often, especially for Python, you would test your code in a notebook first, and then when it's done, port it over into a Py file like this. So when you're doing the process of porting your information from a Jupyter notebook to your Py file, some things to remember, right? What are some functions that you want to use in production? And by in production, I mean like something that your front end will need to use. So for example, in this example here, let's say I wanted to take new data and, I don't know, plot a new data point on this 3D scatter plot. If I want that functionality, a couple of things I will need. One, I will need the pipeline to get the new data into the Teasney format. I will also need the Teasney object to be pickled. So I think if you see over here, this is actually a Teasney model that I've pickled. You know, when you instantiate like any model and fit it, you can actually save the fitted version as a pickle and load it elsewhere. I think I've talked to some of you about this regarding your models. If you want to use them in different notebooks, that's something that you'll do as well. But in thinking about your front end, you have to consider what you need first. One way to go about it, I've actually done this before, as I will literally copy and paste my code from my notebooks onto a Py file, clean out everything that is an output. So for example, you don't need the lines that are just df.head, because df.head doesn't do anything in a front end. So what you're really keeping is just the functions. And if it's functions, it can be, you can put all your functions in one Py file. You can put your functions in the file itself, in the app file itself. I think I mentioned as well, because in a Python file, it is executing everything. You could technically also have your functions all at the top here before, the app code. So yeah, be very mindful. Some common things that you will want to pickle and save are your models, any sort of vectorizer, or for example, like your TF-IDF vectorizer, if you're using that. If you have like a KNN imputation, you will want to use that as well, if that is a step to get from whatever raw data you have to getting your output. Some other things, if you have like, I don't know, if you actually, if you want to plot specific data, sometimes it might be more efficient to save exactly the format that that your graph needs your data to be in, rather than doing the transformations in the script. Those are things that you can consider. I will say creating a front end does take a lot of time, because you do have to think about the entire process of your project, going from like raw inputs to outputs, what is necessary, what needs to be saved. Like for example, I'll show you guys later in a little bit, but this is actually where I learned that it's important that your vectorizer is trained on the right information, and you're saving the right one. So yeah. Oh, I just saw a message. Is hosting a model on AWS an alternative to pickling? I saw people do that with larger transformer models. Absolutely. So that's actually a really good point. I actually personally have never had to do this myself. But if you're looking for an alternative to saving your models, especially if your model files are really big, if you have a giant neural network, you might consider this. What you want to look for is an Amazon S3 bucket. Literally the letter S and the number 3 and bucket. And that actually lets you sort of think of it as like your cloud storage. Basically from like your Python file, you can actually call on, for example, like a neural network that you had saved from AWS, and have it work with that in your script. Yeah, I personally have not needed to set up. I have set up, no, not an S3 bucket specifically, but Amazon tutorials are quite dense, but there are a lot of good walkthroughs actually on YouTube for setting things like that up. I think also that like on the free tier, you have like a good amount of space in an S3 bucket that you can use for any model that you want to host on the internet. Oh yeah, one part that I'm also going to talk about probably tomorrow or maybe even Thursday is how you can get from, all of these, I'm launching these front ends locally, but how you can get them to be hosted on like a web page. And I'll talk about one of the examples that I used. All right then. So I'm just going to recap some of the code here. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I did do that over when we talked about Jupyter Dash a couple weeks back. But basically what's happening here I'm just opening up all the files that I need. Here you can see that I'm doing like a really quick list comprehension because I want to get like my, I forget what this is specifically, but yeah, I'm getting stuff from this CSV and I want it in a list format to be used in my dashboard later. So yeah, I'm basically running a bunch of commands to get the data in the order that I want it before I even start building out the app. So I believe that the version that I uploaded for Jupyter Dash is a lot better annotated. So bear with me with that. But here you can see that I'm defining all of my HTML elements. If you remember, I don't know, I doubt that most people remember because I know we've been through a lot these past couple of weeks, but each object or each like thing or element on this page is an element. So for example, this drop-down list with all of these like IDs is an element. This bar for text is an element. This graph is an element. And also this is actually a space for text as well. This is an element too. So at the start, I'm defining all of these elements. Let's see, where's my, here we go. So this is the header. You can see it says title here corresponding to title here. For my drop down here, I have my drop down list, which is here. The IDs come from this list here. Text input, you can also utilize this in your dashboards. Text inputs here. I think, oh, something cool here that I think would work for some of your dashboards is if you have like multiple things that you want to look at the same time, you can actually add multiple IDs and then, I don't know, have it plot whatever corresponding thing on whatever graph. Cool. I did talk about Bootstrap components very, very briefly, but basically this is kind of like how everything is organized. So you can see here that these are rows, and within each row I have columns. So subhead is what I call the subheader, which is this row here, the row of this ID picker and these sample searches. So that's why you see I have the drop down and I have the text input. And these over here correspond to these variables. So you can see drop down, text input, and it knows to just render the entirety of the drop down and the entirety of the text input in here. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, and the next row would just be like I have my graph here and I have my whatever it was to output be output here. So I like how it's organized in like rows and columns so you know where everything appears on your dashboard. And then after you have all your elements defined, you just put it together in your app. So here you can see that my app.layout is really just header, subheader, and my grid. So this actually makes it really simple. And then callbacks, which is I think the most complicated part. Callbacks all happen at the bottom. And so this is basically, you know, when you change an input, you edit an output. So I actually don't have it done here because yeah, I think it's proprietary information or whatever, but anyways, ideally, if I'm choosing IDs, it would render or it would output or highlight specific points on this graph. And that's something that you can do here with the outputs. And same on this end. This one is actually really simple. This callback, whatever I input in the raw text here, will just render here. So for example, if I say, I don't know, this is output, this is actually at all times reading what's being input here and output here. You can see this because the input is the raw text and the output is in the user details, which is this space here. And yeah, it just returns this. Cool. So this, in terms of the stuff that you would have to figure out, very, very similar to what you have to figure out for Jupyter Dash. I know most of you haven't really started thinking about front ends at this point, but if you know you eventually want to get to a dashboard stage, I highly, highly recommend that you do your EDA graphs or any graphs that you want to be on your dashboard potentially using Plotly, because Plotly is the graph library that Dash uses. So Jupyter Dash or in Dash, this is called Dash. Something else that I wanted to highlight at this time is that Plotly Dash's documentation is really, really good in my opinion. So if you go to docs, you can see that there are a bunch of, oh, that's why, there we go, that looks better. You see that, I mean, I just like how it's set up. Their documentation is actually also built on Dash, which is really neat because they're using their own library. But yeah, tutorials, talking about callbacks. I really learned from reading this documentation. They have a lot of examples for everything. So feel free to just take their code and just adapt it to your own. And if there's something that you don't understand, I will say one of the hardest things to set up is like multiple callbacks. So anything that you have, if you have issues with that, just let me know. But cool. In terms of like having this launch, as I mentioned, all you have to do is do Python followed by the name of what this is. And this is app.py, and then just launch it on this. In terms of getting it from this to like a website on the internet, I'll talk about, because for all of these is actually the same process. So I'll talk about that after we talk about the other kinds of front ends. But yeah, at this point, any questions about Dash? All right, fairly similar to what we had talked about a couple weeks ago with Jupyter Dash. So let's shut this one down. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is Flask. And Flask, I think, is a little easier to set up. There are a few different folders to look at. Sorry, a few different files to look at. But yeah, there we go. So let's open this up to see what's going on. Should I close this out? I'll leave this for now. And let's just take a look at some of the files here. Most of these are only here because this is an app that I actually do have running on a website. So a lot of these files we won't talk about now, but the main ones we're going to talk about are templates, pickles, app, function, and that's it. To talk about it, let me close this out and open the code in Atom. All right, so I have my Flask app loaded here in Atom. Oh, let me close this. All right, so a few things that I want to talk about here. So let me just close this so yeah, okay, we don't have to worry about the Venv. So first thing we're doing, if you remember, I mean, it's hard to remember, but the command to run this is actually Flask underscore app equals app.py Flask run. So this is referring to the fact that the Flask app is on app.py and we want to run this using Flask. When I run this, and just so we remember which project this is, let's just put this up. There we go. So this is that project. So I'll be referring to this web page as I talk about the different elements in the Flask folder. All right, so the first thing we have is the app folder. So the app folder in Flask is slightly different from the Dash because, you know, in the Dash example, the app literally had all of our app details. And this one is slightly different. So here, you can see the main thing. Well, these you always have. Honestly, I'm not even sure what these are for. I guess this like instantiates your app and then whether you can debug your app live or not. And you can see here, these are certain things that I'm importing from Flask. I have requests because I'm taking in inputs from a user who's on this site, and also render template. There are different ways to do this, but render template is basically so that I can render an HTML template on every page of this site or of this app. And also I'm just importing a bunch of functions from there because I have a lot of, this is basically a text classifier. And so I'll show you this later in a little bit, but that's basically like my pipeline for my text classification. Here you can see that there are these things called decorators. Anything above a function that starts with an at, with like an at sign, is called a decorator. And so here, this decorator for Flask, for these functions for Flask, will basically define what renders on what page. So on this, you can see here that I start with the first argument being just a slash. That just means it's on the root of the website. If I do this to be slash model, to get to my model, I actually have to do this set of numbers slash model. And so usually if you just have a Flask app, you don't need to have other stuff. If you want to have other pages on your site, you can actually keep adding on to this. So you would do like at app root slash maybe like about me. You can do like an about me page or about the project, for example. You can have all the information on a different HTML template. So a couple things here with the methods. There's get requests and post requests. Get request is where you take in input. Post request is where you're rendering outputs. So here you can see that get, I'm just rendering this template. Under post, I'm actually running my classification function here. Let me zoom in a little more so y'all can see a little better. Here I'm actually running my classify text function from my functions. And I'm actually also using this, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. I'm actually running my function and seeing, all right, if the prediction is 0, render this template. And if the prediction is 1, render another template. if you have a multi-class problem, you can just render different templates. There's also a way to get it all on one page, like you just click a button and the result will just show up on the page. I'll look for an example of that. I don't actually have any of those examples on my own project. Anyways, yeah, so different prediction results will render different templates. Next, I want to talk about how you get the information from this template to this template. Something that you have to look out for here is, where am I getting this text from? So for this, it kind of comes in when you're setting up your HTML. So with that, we actually have to look into our HTMLs. So all of my HTML templates are in this template folder on the side. I know that this text is very small, but basically there are 3 different HTML pages here. And they're all very, very similar, but I'll start with the main one. So this HTML is this page right here that you're seeing. There's a title, subtitle. This is actually a GIF from Jiffy, and then more text input field, and actually a link to my GitHub. So with this, in all HTML, and again, feel free to just take this and adapt it to your own. In all HTML, there is a head and there's a body. So head has your metadata. So within head, let's see where it starts and ends. So the head starts here at line 3. I think it ends here at 37. So everything here is like metadata. For example, these are all like external style sheets. I wouldn't worry about that. But for example, the title, this title is actually, you know, on like the top of your window, the name of the site. So that title that I have here corresponds to the title that I have here for like the tab, which is very neat. You can actually change that and name it whatever you want. Other things that I have here are, I actually define default styles. So all I did here was for every H1, every H3 and H4 that I have, it uses a specific color. So basically this, I think this is an H1, I think this is H4, this is H3. The H, I think goes 1 through 6, and H1 is the largest text, 6 is the smallest text, and it just gets gradually smaller. And so yeah, these all just have specific colors. These are just other things that I've also defined for the entire page. This, I think I actually took this from somewhere else as well, but this is just saying that all the content will be centered, and you'll sort of see these come back in a little bit. But this is all metadata. None of this information that I have here renders on the page unless it becomes like an attribute for something later in HTML. But it'll make more sense as I get to the actual things that are showing up on the page. So this is all metadata for now, and it belongs in the head of the HTML. So HTML, I think we've seen it quite a bit from our web scraping experience. It is housed, like code is housed between like the greater than, less than brackets, triangle brackets, what's that called? I don't know. But yeah, so you can see the head starts here, ends here at line 37, and then moves on to the body. So everything in the body, actually this is all that's in the body. HTML reads top to bottom. There are actually ways that you can have it come like, you know, side to side in columns. It's just more complicated HTML. Feel free to try it out. I did not want to get into that, but HTML reads top to bottom. So literally here you can see that I start with an H1 to have like my title here of like, did she say that? I have my H4 for my subtitle. And again, you can see like text align center, that's all stuff from the style. The fact that I defined the colors at the start mean that I don't have to define the color every time I have, you know, new text in the body. This is actually like a GIF that I just embedded onto here. So that's this iframe. I have my input text, and then here I have my form. So this part is important for taking in inputs. So let me just zoom in a little bit more. So for taking in inputs, here I have 2 parts. One, I have the text part, and then I have the submit button. So here, what's important to remember is that the name of this is text. You can name it whatever you want, but I guess I should have named it something more specific as well. But the name is text, and this is how it knows to save the information that is being input in this field. And then to end it out, I also have like a hyperlink to my GitHub, and that ends off the HTML. Yeah, any questions so far? Okay. So we're remembering that this is called text. This is important because if we go back to the app.py, this is how it remembers to get text. So the text is request.form.get text. So it's looking for a form on this first HTML template and getting that text, and then it runs it through my prediction function. Now to quickly, again, another tangent, look at the prediction functions. This is basically my pipeline to get text from raw data. And you can see I actually have my NLTK here. I have like my lemmatizer, my different words. Yeah, from this, you can see that I pre-process my data here. I'm also using pickles for my TF-IDF. I think another pickle I have is, oh, here. I actually manually adjusted the words. So I actually have a list of relevant words to filter out. And then finally, I have my multinomial naive Bayes model that I pickled as well. So I'm just loading all three of these pickles, and then this basically gets it to the right format to be fed in as an input to the model. And then this actually models it. So you can see that it's processing, it's using my pre-process function here, and then using the predict function here. And the result ends up being a 0 or a 1. And then based on that, going back to the app.py, based on what the prediction is, I'll render a different template. So just to see an example, this is an example of an innuendo text. So therefore, I rendered this template. Just to really go over, the template is actually even simpler than the first one. This is the template for that. I also have, I think I have the same head information here. Same head information here. Here I also have the variable. So automatically it knows the thing that you're inputting. It actually automatically tracks it as variable. And the way that you do like an F string in HTML is you round it out in 2 curly brackets. So that's why no matter what I put here, it knows to render that up there. And that's just something that I can track the input. And then same thing here, I have another H1, another GIF, and classify another that basically brings you back to the home page. So yeah, there's this, and then it's exactly the same for the other one. It's just a different GIF and a different, different text, but the setup is all the same. Cool. So that is Flask separate from Dash. I feel like for most of you who are doing machine learning models in your project, this would probably be the one that you end up using. Of course, definitely check out Streamlit. That is a little bit easier to set up, and it does have a lot of default styles, so you don't have to do a lot of customization. But yeah, if you know HTML, if you've ever dabbled in HTML, you can customize your own front end with your own code. You can even bring in CSS. I don't remember if any of you have had CSS experience, but yeah, you can do that too. With like the normal way that you do HTML and CSS. I don't do CSS, but yeah. Awesome. I think I'm gonna stop here in terms of the front end material, because yeah, I feel like it'll be too much to have all three at once. So I'll talk about the other doing Flask with Dash together tomorrow. And I'll also talk about some of these other files here, which are basically what allowed me to put this on the internet. So yeah, I'll put up some notes on the capstone guideline sheet, because I think most of you are not going to do the front end right now, rather if anything after graduation. So yeah, cool. At this point, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, you mentioned that you might be able to find an example of where it's output on the same page. I think that would be useful for me, since I'm doing more of like a search engine. I would rather have the output on the same page.
Absolutely. I will Yeah, I know I have students who have done that, so I'll source their projects and send them over.
Thank you so much.
Actually, you can actually do the same thing with Dash as well. And it might be easy. Dash is easier to do just because there's a version that allows you to test that within a notebook. You would just be like, instead of a dashboard that has graphs, it's just a dashboard with like inputs and outputs. Dash actually works a little bit faster as well. Is that something that you want to look into?
Yeah, I sort of got the impression that Dash was useful if you were doing graphs, if you were doing Plotly, but if I was just doing sort of a search engine, I don't know, this seemed to make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you could try is, let me just open a different one. If I show you the dash, you know, the part where I typed in something and it just rendered the same text?
Yeah.
You could actually do something like that, but instead of rendering the same text, feed that through a function to render your results. And because Dash is continuously updating, or it's continuously like checking the input to render the output, it is a little bit faster. But yeah, I'll also look for a Flask example and I'll send that out.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah, I didn't need to do this. Any other questions? Doesn't have to be about front ends at this point, can be about anything else. All right, sounds good. I'll stop the recording here and then we'll see if there are any other questions.